Darius Holt was 39 years old the morning his wife stood in a Nashville courtroom and won everything. The house on Pembroke Lane, the joint investment accounts, 17 years of accumulated equity, and turned to her attorney with a smile that had been rehearsed so many times it had stopped resembling joy and started resembling something else entirely. He had watched her from across the gallery. He had watched her the way he watched load-bearing walls before he touched them, methodically, without reaction, noting every point of stress and every place where the structure had been quietly compromised. She was wearing the navy suit she'd bought 3 months prior, the one she'd told him was for a job interview. There had been no job interview. He had known that for 7 weeks. He had said nothing about it. He had simply continued doing what he had always done, which was document everything and move in straight lines and wait for the moment when the full weight of what had been built came to rest on the supports that were actually there. The judge had announced the ruling at 10:47 in the morning. Darius received the news the way a structural engineer receives confirmation that a beam is compromised, without panic, with a quiet mental note that the load needed to be redistributed immediately. His wife, Adrienne, had too. $3 million in hidden assets that no one in that courtroom, except Darius, his attorney, and a forensic accountant named Raymond Osai, knew about yet. She had spent 14 months moving money through a web of accounts she believed were invisible. She had been wrong about that for 11 of those months. What Adrienne did not understand, what her attorney did not understand, what no one in that sunlit courtroom understood, was that Darius had handed them the case they thought they won. 20 minutes after that ruling, the judge called her back. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The house on Pembroke Lane had a front porch that Darius had rebuilt from scratch in the spring of the year they had been almost happy. He had pulled up the original boards, pine, rotted in 3 places near the railing posts, and replaced them with pressure-treated lumber that he had selected himself at the yard, running his hand along each board to find the ones without warp. He had not hired anyone to help him. He was a structural engineer by profession and by temperament, which meant he had a hard time delegating work that required judgment. You could delegate measurements. You could delegate cuts. You could not delegate the moment when you placed a board and felt whether it was sitting true. His grandmother, Vera Holt, had told him when he was 11 years old that the quality of a man's work when no one was watching was the only honest measure of his character. She had been talking about him skipping steps in the multiplication tables during a math drill. But she had a way of saying things that meant more than the immediate situation required. And he had carried that particular sentence into every job site and every calculation and every marriage he'd ever tried to build. Vera was 83 now and lived in a care facility in Clarksville, and on the Sundays he visited she still asked him, in a voice quieter than it used to be, whether he was building things that were going to last. He had always told her yes. For the past 3 years, that answer had required more from him than it used to. He was a senior structural consultant at a firm called Meridian Engineering Group, which meant that he was the person called in when other engineers had already made decisions that were starting to feel wrong. He found the problems that had been paved over. He found the places where the load had been quietly transferred onto supports that were not rated to carry it. He was the one who walked a building and felt in his feet and his hands, and the particular quietness of his attention where the structure was lying to itself. He had been doing this professionally for 14 years, and in his marriage for approximately the last 3. His other phone, a separate device registered to a holding company, Claudette, had helped him structure years ago for a different purpose, had been sitting in his desk drawer at the office for 11 months, accumulating documentation he had not yet decided what to do with. He had not moved it. He had not told Adrienne it existed. He had simply added to it methodically, the way an engineer builds a case file. One observation at a time, never assuming, always verifying, letting the pattern reveal itself rather than forcing the shape. Adrienne was beautiful and controlled, and had the kind of ambition that organized itself around other people's resources. He had not seen that clearly at first, or perhaps he had seen it and chosen to interpret it charitably, which was a habit he had been working to correct. She had been a marketing manager when they met, sharp and quick-talking and certain of her own direction. He had admired that certainty. He had not yet learned that certainty and integrity were separate qualities that did not always travel together. He remembered meeting her at a conference dinner in Atlanta 17 years ago. She had been at the next table and had turned around to ask him if he knew whether the hotel had a business center open past 9. He had said he thought it did. She had said thank you and turned back to her table. 20 minutes later, she had turned around again and told him that the business center closed at 8 and that he had been wrong. He had laughed. She had laughed. They had talked until midnight in the hotel lobby, and he had driven the 300 miles back to Nashville the next morning, understanding that his life had been reorganized by a conversation in a hotel lobby, and that he did not entirely mind. That was the version of her he had tried to build a marriage around. The version that had shown up at that table, turned around twice, laughed at midnight. He had spent 3 years trying to find where that version had gone. They had married when he was 22 and she was 23. They had bought the house on Pembroke Lane 4 years later with a combination of his savings and a down payment that came, he understood much later, from a business account she had been managing jointly with a man named Preston Ware. Preston Ware was a commercial real estate developer based in Brentwood. He wore Italian shoes and drove a white Range Rover, and had been involved with Adrienne in varying degrees of intensity for most of the time that Darius had been involved with her as a husband. That last part had taken him a long time to accept. Not because he lacked the evidence, but because the evidence, assembled in full, implied something about the architecture of his marriage that he had not wanted to be true. A man who spent his career finding the hidden failures in other people's structures was not always prepared to find them in his own. That was the particular cost of having built something you believed in. The disassembly was slower and more painful than the building had ever been. He had found out on a Thursday. He had come home 2 hours early from a site visit in Murfreesboro because the inspection had been canceled and there was no reason to stay. The house on Pembroke Lane had been quiet in the way that houses are quiet when they should not be. He had noted the unfamiliar vehicle in the driveway, a dark gray sedan. Not Preston's Range Rover, something more anonymous than that, which in retrospect was itself a piece of information. He had gone inside. He had gone upstairs. He had understood, from the sounds and the specific quality of the silence that followed, exactly what he had walked into. He had gone back downstairs. He had sat in the kitchen that he had tiled himself, slate gray, handset, grouted over a long February weekend 3 years ago when the marriage had seemed like something worth maintaining with that level of care. And he had poured a glass of water and drunk it slowly and then taken out his phone and opened the notes application. His hands did not shake. He typed 2 words. Day 1. He had been a structural engineer for 14 years. He knew that the way to address a compromised structure was not to kick the wall in. It was to understand the full extent of the damage first. You did not begin removing material until you knew what was holding weight. You did not begin removing material until you had something in place to carry the load. You mapped the failure completely before you touched a single board, because the worst thing you could do was act on a partial understanding and bring something down that was still standing. He went back upstairs after 15 minutes. The gray sedan was still in the driveway. He knocked twice on the bedroom door, the way a man knocks when he is not asking permission. There was a very long silence. He said through the door in a voice that was entirely level, "When you're ready, I'll be in my office." He drove to the office. He sat at his desk. He opened the folder he had been building for 11 months, transaction records, calendar discrepancies. A set of text message screenshots he had obtained through means he had never needed to explain to anyone. Bank statements. The business registration filing for an LLC in Adrienne's maiden name that he had found through a public records search 4 months prior, and had said nothing about. He added a new note to the file. He labeled it Thursday and wrote down everything he had seen in a precise, factual sequence. Then he spent 2 hours going back through the previous 11 months of documentation and finding the places where the gray sedan appeared. Once in the background of a photograph Adrienne had texted him from what she said was a client dinner, the sedan visible at the edge of the parking lot. Once in a toll record he had obtained from a shared account she had forgotten he had access to. Twice in dates that corresponded with calendar entries, marked as work travel that had not, on closer inspection, involved any travel at all. He had not been looking for confirmation. The confirmation had found him. He had simply been precise enough to notice it. He drove back to the office and called his attorney before 5 o'clock. Her name was Claudette Marsh. She had been practicing family law in Nashville for 22 years and had the manner of someone who had heard everything at least 3 times and had stopped being surprised by any of it. She listened to what Darius said in about 4 minutes. Then she asked him 3 questions. How long he believed the relationship had been ongoing, whether he had any access to joint financial records, and whether he owned anything separately that had not been commingled with marital assets. He answered all 3 questions accurately. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Don't change anything in your behavior. Don't move any money. Don't say anything at home that you would not want a judge to hear. Come in Monday morning," he said. "All right?" He drove home and made dinner. Adrienne came downstairs at 7. He told her the site visit had gone long. She said the traffic on I-65 had been terrible. He asked if she was hungry. They ate together at the table he had refinished himself, on plates she had picked out. In a kitchen he had built with his own hands, and he was the only one at that table who understood the full situation. He was done. He was also not finished yet. Those were different things. The following Monday, Claudette reviewed his financial records with the focus of someone who had spent 2 decades in the specific architecture of marital deception. She found the first irregularity inside 20 minutes. Adrienne had opened a savings account 14 months prior, funded by transfers from their joint checking-in amounts that stayed below the threshold that would have triggered automatic flagging. $4,700 here, $6,200 there, never a round number, never twice in the same month. 63 transfers, 11 months. Total withdrawn, $219,000. Claudette set down her pen. This was not impulsive, she said. No, Darius said. She had help structuring this. The amounts are too deliberate for someone doing this alone for the first time. He nodded. He had already thought that. He said, "Preston Ware." Claudette wrote the name down. "Tell me what you know about him." He told her everything. He had not spent the previous 4 days idle. He had pulled every public record he could access, property filings, business registrations, court records. Preston Ware had 2 prior civil judgments against him for breach of contract. He had been a party in a business dispute 4 years prior involving the alleged misappropriation of investor funds. The case had settled. The settlement terms were sealed. Claudette looked at what he had compiled. She looked at it for a long time. "You built this in 4 days," she said. "It's what I do," Darius said. "I find the places where the load isn't sitting where people say it is." She looked at him over the top of her reading glasses. I'm going to need a forensic accountant. I know someone. His name was Raymond Osai, and he was 47 years old, and had the quiet confidence of a man who had spent his career inside other people's financial decisions and had very rarely been surprised by what he found. He met with Darius and Claudette the following Thursday. He reviewed the account documentation and the transfer history and the business registration records for a Brentwood LLC that Adrienne had incorporated 8 months prior, 2 months after the transfers began. The LLC was called Meridian Creative Partners, which was either a coincidence or a deliberate provocation. Darius had decided it was a coincidence. It did not matter either way. Raymond traced $3 million in assets, real property, business interests, a brokerage account held in the name of the LLC that Adrienne had assembled and shielded from the marital estate over a period spanning nearly 2 years. Some of it was hers. Some of it came from Preston Ware, who had, Raymond noted without editorializing, a documented interest in ensuring that the assets were held in a name other than his own, given his prior legal exposure. Raymond set his pen down in the same way Claudette had set hers down. She had no idea Tennessee family courts had adopted forensic accounting evidentiary standards 2 years ago, he said. He was speaking to no one in particular. She's not a lawyer, Darius said. No, Raymond said. She is not. But someone who was a lawyer should have told her. He paused. Or perhaps that person knew and didn't care, because the assets were structured in her name and not his. Darius looked at the documents spread across Claudette's conference table. He thought about Preston Ware in the back row of the courthouse with a small nod. He thought about a man who had arranged things so that all the legal exposure would fall on someone else. He moved with the same deliberate calm that defined all his actions. That weekend, he went home. He cooked dinner. He asked Adrienne about her week. She told him that a client presentation had gone well and that she was thinking about having the back hallway repainted. He said that sounded fine. He asked what color she was thinking. She said something warm, maybe a terracotta. He said that could look nice. They ate, and he cleaned the kitchen, and she watched something in the living room, and he sat at the kitchen table and reviewed site drawings for a bridge inspection in Gallatin. She had no idea that 3 feet away from her, on the other side of a wall he had insulated himself, the structure of the life she thought she was building was already fully documented, fully mapped, and quietly waiting. 3 days passed. Claudette came to Darius with a proposal. She had the documentation. She had the forensic accounting. She had the LLC filings, the transfer records, the pattern of deliberate structuring. She could file immediately and demand a full financial disclosure hearing before the divorce proceedings formally opened. That was option 1. Option 2 was different. You let her file first, Claudette said. You let her attorney build the case on the financial picture they believe is accurate. You let the ruling come down. And then, before she can act on it, we present everything. Darius was quiet for a moment. That's a significant risk, he said. It is, Claudette agreed. The reward is that the judge sees the full scope of the deception at a moment when it cannot be explained away as a misunderstanding or a bookkeeping error. She will have just won a ruling based on a fraudulent financial disclosure. The judge will have just been used as an instrument of that fraud. He thought about load-bearing walls. He thought about the moment when the full weight of a compromised structure came to rest on supports that could not hold it. How long do we have once the ruling comes down? He said. 20 minutes is enough, Claudette said, if we are ready. He nodded. They were ready. Adrienne's attorney presented a clean case. Darius's attorney offered no significant resistance. The ruling took 45 minutes to reach. Darius received it from across the gallery without expression. Adrienne received it with the smile she had been practicing. Her attorney shook her hand. Preston Ware, seated in the back row behind a woman Darius did not recognize, allowed himself a small nod. Darius sat with his hands folded in his lap and said nothing. Claudette Marsh stood up. She said, "Your Honor, before this court adjourns, the respondent respectfully requests the opportunity to enter supplemental documentation into the record under Tennessee Code Annotated 364121, pertaining to fraudulent financial disclosure in marital dissolution proceedings." The courtroom went still. Adrienne's attorney turned. The judge looked at Claudette over his glasses with the expression of a man who had presided over a great many courtrooms and had learned to recognize, by a very specific quality of silence, when something significant was about to occur. He said, "Proceed." What Claudette laid on the record in the next 11 minutes was not a surprise to Darius, and not a surprise to Raymond Osei, and not a surprise to the judge, who was already reviewing the submitted exhibits with a stillness that was more alarming in its way than any display of reaction would have been. It was a surprise to everyone else. The LLC. The $2, $3 million in shielded assets. The 63 transfers over 11 months. The structuring pattern. The prior civil judgments against Preston Ware. The forensic accounting certification. The testimony declaration from Raymond Osei, submitted in written form, which laid out with complete clarity the anatomy of a financial deception that had been in construction for 22 months. Adrienne's attorney stood up. He started to speak. The judge raised one hand. He said, "Counsel, sit down." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the exhibit binders. He looked at Adrienne. She had stopped smiling. He said, "I'm going to need 20 minutes." He called her back in 18. He vacated the ruling in its entirety. He ordered a full financial disclosure audit. He referred the matter of fraudulent submission to the court's oversight body and noted for the record that the respondent's counsel reserved the right to pursue criminal contempt proceedings. He awarded Darius Holt an emergency asset freeze on the LLC pending full discovery. Preston Ware left the courtroom without the small nod. He left quickly. His attorney, who had not been seated in that courtroom and who received the news by phone in a Brentwood office 14 miles away, called him back twice before he answered. Adrienne sat at the plaintiff's table after the courtroom had mostly emptied. Her attorney was speaking to her in a low voice. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the far wall in the way that people look at things when they are not actually seeing them, when what they are seeing instead is the specific moment when everything they thought they had built revealed itself to have been resting on nothing at all. Darius stood in the hallway outside and waited for Claudette. He did not feel triumphant. He had never confused the correction of a structural failure with a victory. The building had been compromised. Now the compromised sections were being removed. What came next was the work of rebuilding on honest ground. Claudette came out of the courtroom and stood beside him. She had the composed, unhurried manner of someone who had known for some time that this moment was coming. He said, "What happens now?" She said, "Now the real accounting begins." He nodded. He looked at the courthouse window. Nashville light in October was thin and specific, the kind of light that showed everything without warmth. "You picked the wrong man to build against," he said quietly, to no one in particular. "I find the load paths. That's all I do." 9 months later, Darius Holt was standing in the backyard of a house in East Nashville that he had purchased on his own and was in the process of renovating on weekends. The way his grandmother had always said, a man should own the things he lived inside, not just by deed, but by the work of his own hands in the walls. The divorce had finalized in February. The full financial disclosure had surfaced too. $3 million in concealed assets, which the court redistributed according to Tennessee marital law. Darius received the house on Pembroke Lane and a settlement figure his accountant described as equitable and Claudette described, privately, as just. He sold Pembroke within 60 days. He did not want the porch he had rebuilt. He wanted to build a different one. Adrienne had lost her attorney partway through the discovery process when it became clear that the fraudulent submission exposure created a professional liability issue he was not willing to carry. Her second attorney had negotiated a settlement that preserved less than a third of what she had expected to walk away with. The LLC had been dissolved under court order. The brokerage account had been split. The real property, a condominium in Brentwood that she and Preston had purchased jointly through the LLC, had been sold at a court-ordered liquidation price that disappointed both of them. Preston Ware was facing a separate civil action from one of his prior investors who had been watching the contempt proceedings and had, in the phrase his own attorney used, seen an opening. That matter was not yet resolved. It was moving, as these things moved, in one direction. Adrienne was working as an account coordinator at a mid-size marketing firm in Antioch. It was a position 2 levels below what she had held before. Her professional network, which had been her primary currency for most of her adult life, had contracted sharply in the months following the contempt referral. These things traveled, in professional communities, at the speed of true things. She had not called Darius. He had not expected her to. He had met a woman named Simone at a site visit in the spring. She was a project manager for a commercial development firm, precise and unhurried, with the habit of asking the exact right questions slightly before he had finished setting up the context for it. He had found that interesting the first time, and confirming the second. They had dinner once a week, and she had told him, on the fourth occasion, that she appreciated that he was a man who did not perform more than he was. He had thought about that for several days afterward. The backyard in East Nashville was coming along. He had built the raised garden beds himself from reclaimed cedar, 4 of them, in a configuration that maximized the southern light. His grandmother had kept a garden. She had grown pole beans and collard greens and a variety of tomato that she claimed was descended from seeds her own grandmother had kept. He had not inherited the seeds. He had inherited the habit of the thing. He pressed a seedling into the soil with both thumbs and settled it gently into place. Some structures, he thought, you do not rescue. You document them fully. You understand what failed and why. And then you clear the site and begin again from a foundation that can actually bear the weight of what you want to build. He was not angry. He was not bitter. Bitterness required ongoing emotional investment in people who no longer deserved it, and he was a man who had learned, over the course of a long and careful career, to allocate load precisely. He stood up and brushed the soil from his hands. The morning was good. The garden was beginning. The foundation was honest. That was enough. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.